Let them share the mic.
Okay, and you are listening to Live from the Heartland, WLUW 88.7 FM on your dial. This is Katy Hogan, and I'm about to welcome our first guest, Charlie Meyerson, who is not here for the first time. Welcome back, Charlie.
Great to be here.
You are a publisher of the Chicago Public Square.
.com.
.com. Is that how people find
You
it?
have to put the publisher part or just the Chicago Public Square?
ChicagoPublicSquare.com will get you right there.
How's it going with that?
Great. I'm having tremendous fun with this. Launched about a year and a half ago. Daily email news summary for and about the Chicago area. Goes to about 1,500 people a day now, which is a number that pleases me.
Yeah, that's good. That's not insignificant.
It has branched out beyond a daily email. Now do an almost daily newscast. People can listen on the web, of course. You can click on the link. You can go to, if you have an Amazon Alexa powered speaker, you can add Chicago Public Square newscast to your Alexa speaker. If you have another favorite way to listen to podcasts, you can add it by RSS. You'll know what that means. And so we're kind of having fun doing radio, doing daily email, and keeping Chicago informed.
So, as someone who is regularly checking Public Square, because it is a great summary and roundup of not only Chicago news, but what's happening nationally, because that impacts us here. But there's always an interesting flair to how you introduce the links. It's basically a glorified aggregation tool.
I don't like aggregation. It's such
using
a
an
bloodless
old-fashioned term.
It's a bloodless term, and it suggests. I mean,
Bloodless?
what I'm doing, both in email and by audio, is I'm newscasting.
Yes.
I am rounding up the news and delivering it in what I hope is a compelling, engaging way for people to consume news.
Well, I am curious that you're up to 1,500. Do you know how many people are listening to the podcast?
No, unfortunately, podcast metrics are still back in the dark ages. I can tell you several hundred people a day visiting the page that hosts the audio. How many people actually listen is still something of a mystery. Apple's begun to provide podcasting data, but that's just for Apple devices. Still in the dark ages.
I did have a question, Charlie, about your...
You should ask it then.
I'm going to ask you about your site. Is it do you have to pay to look at it?
No.
Good. 'Cause
Absolutely,
us
it's
guys
free.
who try to look at a lot of stuff have a hard time with certain spots.
I think that paywalls are short-sighted crutches used by news organizations that are struggling and should be struggling in the sense that we want them to survive, to find ways to get money into the till, but counterproductive in the long run because you limit. I mean, by definition, there's only a limited number or a limited percentage of the humans in the audience who have the money to pay.
Right. New York Times charges you, but The Guardian doesn't. But they keep saying they might.
The Guardian is, I think, a great example of, with their notices, their persistent nagging notices, saying we want to stay free, but chip in some money to help us keep it free. That's actually a model that I'm using at Chicago Public Square. It's the nagging model. Do you like this? Do you find it useful? If so, kick in a few pennies a day so it continues
We're accustomed to the
go on.
nagging model.
Nagging is, I think it works
It's where it's at.
along with advertising, which I think is another important and still not really optimized funding method that news organizations can use to keep themselves going.
So how are our main sources of news, which are still newspapers, even if we're getting them digitally, much of what you see on the web is feeding off of the New York Times, Washington Post, Tribune, Sun-Times?
And Chicago Public Square absolutely would not be what it is without the tremendous work done by those news organizations. Anyone
There you
who
go.
visits Chicago Public Square knows that, I mean, it is, in essence, a directory to some of the best work being done by all those organizations.
Well put, very well put.
So, if nothing else, Chicago Public Square I see as a service to those organizations because we're continually introducing readers, visitors to the work done by these great organizations.
In 5 years, how are those newspapers going to look? Will you still have them as a source for your news tool?
I think the news organizations will exist, and I hope they exist. But will they be newspapers? That's a good question. A friend asked me the other day whether, and I won't say which one of the Chicago newspapers will exist in 2 years. And I said, yeah, I think so, but it might not be in print.
Right.
It's, the medium of paper is antiquated, and I think for the generations to come will just not be the way people consume information. So, but I think there's a good model to be had for a digital-only news organization that brings the resources that we've associated with newspapers to bear on a digital-only product.
And with the consolidation and selling, and specifically I'm thinking about Sinclair Broadcasting.
Sinclair Broadcast Group, the group that wants to buy the formerly Tribune-owned WGN Radio and Television.
Exactly, so you just
Force
use the
everybody
word
to
wants to
play their
buy.
editorials.
Yeah, it's going through the protocol in Washington with the Federal Communications
Right.
Commission.
So
to
that's-
support- And it is now, and again, open for public comment. People can weigh in
Oh,
whether the
please,
FCC.
people. Yeah,
And we've been mentioning this on Chicago Public Square with some regularity.
I don't know if this is the time. I'll just shoot this in here.
Do it.
It's, we've been doing the 50 years later thing. And I didn't realize how much younger you were than us, Charlie.
Not that much
Jeez.
younger.
Well, I mean, you're somewhere between the youngsters who run us here, the engineers and videographers. Anyway,
Well, yeah,
50
okay,
years ago,
I'm very young.
50 years ago
Right
this
there.
week was yet another tragic moment in American history, U.S. history, and that was the assassination of RFK, Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy, mere hours after he had won the California primary and was definitely en route to winning the nomination and quite possibly becoming a president and quite possibly changing everything that happened since. Where were you? What do you remember of it? If my co-hosts want to chime in about theirs, feel free.
I remember very little about the actual night of Robert F. Kennedy's assassination. I do remember, I was 13 in 1968. Happens
See,
to
I
be-
told you.
Yeah, okay, a baby, if you want. It was the year in August that my family actually moved from Michigan to Illinois, so an important personal year. But, for kids of that age, we saw Kennedy assassinated. Earlier that year, we saw King assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was the next. And I think, to the extent that we were thinking about anything, many of us probably thought, well, okay, this is the world we live in which prominent political figures are going to get killed.
Guns down. Yeah.
And unfortunately, that to some degree proved to be the case.
Well, we've moved on from presidents to students, unfortunately, it seems, in terms
Yeah.
of the epidemic of guns that we're dealing with.
Well, there was, Ford and Reagan also were shot.
John Lennon.
Ford wasn't shot, right? He was, Squeaky Fromm was caught
And then Malcolm X got
planting,
killed.
yeah.
But you certainly
Exactly.
wouldn't have imagined, as you're dealing with the reality of prominent people being knocked off, that we would be consumed with news like Roseanne this past week.
No.
Or Samantha Bee, for that matter.
Yeah.
What do you think of what I see as a distraction from real news? The squirrel stories, as I call them, which we have at least 2 or 3 of, it seems like, every news cycle, that really divert us, I think, from the serious stuff going on behind the scenes and, quite frankly, sometimes right in front of our face.
Well, I like to think people can multitask. I'm capable of being
He's very
outraged.
kind.
I'm capable of being outraged about several things at once. And I, while I would not in any way minimize what you might consider the more serious issues, I think this question of civil discourse and what people say and whether they can or should say it and where and how they say it is central to, what makes civil liberties in this country work. So, whether people can say things, whether people should say things, I think is an important ongoing debate that our society should have.
It was quite a quick visceral reaction, given that this personality has been spouting stuff kind of all along. It's part of her kind of persona, her career. A working class Sarah Palin, if you will. She was famous even before Sarah Palin.
I don't know
came
who
on the
that's
scene.
being kind to.
Well, you can take
Sarah,
it
yeah.
however you wish, but I couldn't help thinking of that dynamic this week as this whole thing played out.
Well, everything happens faster and faster and faster. And again, that's one reason, sort of the secret origin of Chicago Public Square. Back in January of 2016, I had a number of friends coming to me and saying, I can't keep up with the news. You know, because this is when Trump was coming into office, and every day, every hour, there were new rumors or announcements of what he was doing. People said, I just can't keep up with it. Do you know anyone who's kind of organizing and collating all this stuff? And I thought to myself, well, I can do that. That's a newscaster's function. We need, as a civilization, more and better tools to help us track this stuff, but I think we're getting there.
Okay.
I think news organizations in general are becoming more nimble, more versatile, and we're all still feeling our way through this, but I'm optimistic we'll work it out.
Charlie Meyerson, speaking of tools, how does a reporter begin to sort through the 10 candidates running for mayor, and how would a Metro desk editor decide who gets coverage?
Good question.
I would credit that question to Thom.
I take some comfort, having worked in a number of news organizations over the not quite so many years as you guys maybe thought I had worked in newsrooms.
Yeah, I thought you were more ancient.
Yeah, I just act like an old guy. But I take some comfort in the fact the election, the primary is not until the beginning of next year, so we have months yet to go before voters are going to be in a position to actually make a decision. I think much relies on the candidates. I think the savvy candidates have the opportunity in this media landscape of ours to take control of their own coverage, to bypass, and in some cases make the jobs easier for news editors by making their own news happen. Once upon a time, if a candidate wanted to get the public's attention, the candidate needed the reporters from the Tribune, the Sun-Times, channels 2, 7, 9, 11, 32, to show up. Now, we've seen it this week, for instance, not by a candidate, but by the Chicago Public School System, releasing an ad highly critical of Mayor Emanuel and his series of school CEOs. They didn't buy TV time. They did get news coverage, but it began with an ad that they published online for
Who's the union?
The Chicago Public. I'm sorry,
Teachers
Chicago
Union.
Teachers Union.
Okay,
Did I not say the Teachers Union?
You
Forgive me.
said CPS.
The schools, yeah, the Teachers Union created this ad.
Yeah.
Created quite a bit of buzz with, their own video production. And while there's great value in the gatekeeper function of news editors, there's a certain responsibility the candidates have to draw attention to their own campaigns, communicating directly with their voters, and in some cases sort of, I won't say forcing, but encouraging news desks to pay attention to their campaign. And to some extent, that's a function of leadership. Mm-hmm. So, I think to some extent we'll see the candidates begin to sort themselves out. Who has command of communications channels, who has the ability to get the attention of the voters, and that will begin to influence how the news desks cover these candidates.
Charlie, can you give us a sense who might be the savvy ones?
No.
Okay.
It's too early. They're clearly, some names have begun to surface more than others. Lori Lightfoot is one.
Right.
Bridget Gaynor, who hasn't officially declared herself, got some publicity.
Get out of town.
Got some publicity this week that
Get out of town, Meyerson. We don't need another Irish person in there.
She has some explaining to do, and once the Sun-Times determined that her someone driving.
Show, right?
Well, good.
Yeah,
I hope you'll pin her down on who in her household, driving cars licensed to her household, has racked up. Is it 200 tickets?
Yeah.
I think I have that record beat.
I'd like to know how that
Close.
happens. So she's not officially a candidate yet,
No.
so it's not
So
really quite.
the Sun-Times, I'll be honest, is one outlet that I think has, because of a particular columnist, seems to love to cover the white men challenging Rahm, but rarely gets around to anyone else in the field. And that's part of why I asked this question. There are already editorial decisions being made, and you would think that Gary McCarthy and Paul Vallis are the only challengers to Rahm if you read a certain columnist in the Sun-Times.
Who are we talking about?
Yeah, who were
Snead.
Michael Snead.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
whose
is that
side is
just-
she on?
That's
Well,
Time
she's
for-
a columnist.
Yeah.
She's not a news reporter, and I think anyone who reads her should bear in mind she is a columnist
Right.
with friends and a network that that often propel her coverage.
Yeah.
Which is valuable in its own way. But hey, she's not the editorial page, she's not the news desk, she's not the front page.
So does a news editor at a union-owned newspaper try to balance coverage that columnists may be steering one way or not? As an editor, how, that really is what I'm trying to...
Why are you
I'm
grinning,
not,
Charlie?
I'm not an editor in that position, so I really can't answer. A news editor, ideally, is loyal to and faithful to the needs and desires of his or her audience, and not the owners, the managers, the advertisers.
Fair enough.
I thought you were going to say is loyal to the news, period.
Well, I think the
Sort of
news
what you
is
think.
what best serves the people consuming the
Well,
news.
yeah, I think we might have to actually state that from here on out because of the famous faux news that
Hereby stipulated.
hereby exactly.
So does the new drive to unionize journalists affect this dynamic at all?
I don't know, and I need to do a disclaimer, okay? As I believe is public knowledge, my son works for the Chicago Tribune, which is going through this unionization discussion. So I try to stay away from it.
Somebody as young as you has a son old enough to work at the Trib?
Somebody as young as me has I don't know if this has been said on the radio, and I may get in trouble for saying it, but a grandchild imminently due.
Oh,
So.
Any moment.
Congratulations.
We're lucky to have you today.
Well, I'm delighted the timing has worked out to allow me.
Charlie,
So,
as always, we could, spend the hour
Yeah.
with you,
Yeah,
but
someday we
we
will.
have some other guests to
you
bring
should
on.
get them on pronto.
And lots of live music coming up as well. But we really appreciate your coming on to Liveville Heartland, and good luck with Chicago Public Square.
Thank you.
And the new baby.
ChicagoPublicSquare.com.
Yeah, and stick around for the group photo if you don't have to run off to the maternity ward.
I haven't gotten the call yet. I can
Okay.
stick.
Good.